Another Puscast, probably the last one for 2016. The next one will cover the last 2 weeks of December 2016, but I will be babbling away in 2017. As always, the references are available at edgydoc.com. Don't forget, Christmas season is coming up, so it's a great time to buy the Pus Whisperer, my 2 collections of infectious disease blog entries. They are great presents for the pus lover in your life. And finally, if you get a moment, go to iTunes and write me a glowing review. Unless, of course, you are FUO Doc, who already says I, quote, lack emotional maturity, that my communication skills are blunted by juvenile rants and foul language, and refers to me as an arrogant, intolerant, obscene verbal bully. It's nice to know someone's paying attention, and I may just have my new motto. But this is about the medical literature, not my personality disorders. The references, of course, are at edgydoc.com, where you will also find links to my growing multimedia empire. But let's get on with the last podcast, or Puscast, of 2016. So, regular listeners, and you have my sympathies, are used to the bee in my bonnet of the long-term evils of infection-induced inflammation. This study looked at HIV patients who remained suppressed but weren't so good at taking their medications. They were virally suppressed but not adherent with their compliance or compliant with their adherence, whatever the current buzzword is. What's interesting is even though they were suppressed, they had higher levels of inflammatory markers such as interleukin 6, 10, and 2, interferon gamma, TNF-alpha, and C-reactive protein than those who were adherent with their compliance or compliant with their adherence. They postulate that this is likely due to HIV replication below the limit of detection. Inflammation is bad. HIV patients have an increased risk of a variety of vascular disease, in part because of the increased inflammation. So even if they're virally suppressed on what my father would have referred to as half-assed adherence, they still need to be encouraged to take all their pills all the time. And, of course, stop smoking. You always have to take modeling with a grain of salt substitute, especially if it's America's top model. But this was a model that looked at what kind of benefit if you had good adherence to pre-exposure prophylaxis for HIV. And they estimate that 40% coverage would lead to 1,162 fewer infections per 1,000 person years, and that the number needed to treat would be 25. So that pre-exposure prophylaxis looks to be the way to go, because anyone who thinks you're going to rely upon condoms is nuts. Toxoplasma is a fascinating parasite. To quote the introduction, recent evidence from animal and human studies suggests that latent toxoplasma infection can result in behavioral changes, including increased impulsivity, aggression, suicide attempts, difficulties with learning in mice, with memory, reaction time, and humans have more traffic accidents if they are toxopositive. There's nothing like combining impulsivity, aggression, and driving in males especially. I need to get my toxoplasma serology checked in anticipation of my next speeding ticket. Officer, it's not me. It's the parasite. I don't think they'll buy it. But interestingly, this looked at the neurocognitive functioning of HIV-infected patients. And the higher their IgG levels with latent, I could emphasize latent toxoplasmosis, the more neurocognitive problems that they had. These are things like recall, executive function, learning, working memory, verbal, motor, and speed of information processing. Toxo's a nasty beast. And why, when I have my cat, it's always well done. 2 quick HPV of note. 1, the current CDC recommendations are that girls between the ages of 9 and 14 only need 2 instead of 3 doses of the vaccine. And also, the vaccine is effective. Just comparing data from 2009-10 to 2011-12 and looking at the incidence of HPV in women who received the vaccine, you will find a decrease from 15.4 to 8.5%. So in 2 years, it almost dropped in half. And supposedly, hopefully, expectantly, the same will happen with cervical cancer, rectal cancer, and oral cancer in the future. I know we're not supposed to be paternalistic, but they found that vaccine adherence increases when the physician says, it's time for the vaccine, not, do you want a vaccine? It's always in how you phrase your interaction with the patients. The one good thing about cold weather is the mosquitoes are gone, and at least for the short term, the chance of mosquito-borne illness is down. 2 things of interest, at least with Zika. 1, Brownsville, poor Brownsville, Texas, is now on the list of places with a travel advisory because of Zika. Brownsville really is our chicken in the coal mine, canary in a coal mine, for mosquito-borne illnesses. First, they saw an increase in dengue seropositivity and now Zika. The other thing to keep in mind is that mosquitoes carry more than one possible infection. And this looked at patients in Nicaragua and found that of 263 patients, 192 had an infection with a single virus, Zika, chikungunya, or dengue. But the rest had 2 or more viruses infecting them. And Zika, chikungunya, and dengue can all present similarly with rash, cytopenias, fevers, that make it difficult to distinguish amongst the 3 viruses clinically. And there is cross-reaction serologically, so really it's PCR that may be the best way to make the diagnosis between the different viruses. That probably applies to Brownsville, Texas as well. Brownsville, it's a good place to be from. The nice thing about a travel advisory for Brownsville, though, is really who wants to go to Brownsville? But at least we know when they build that wall, it will keep those mosquito-borne illnesses out. That's a juvenile political rant for those of you who weren't paying attention. The problem with press releases is that they always way overstate the importance of a particular study. This study found that there was a difference in illness in Japanese women versus men if they had HTLV1, with women having less severe disease, although that was not found in the Caribbean. And they point out that there may be differential evolution in viruses so that they have different illnesses in women than in men, perhaps in order to perpetuate fitness and transmission of disease. There's also a difference in how men and women respond physiologically to infections. And so they suggest that perhaps there is a real phenomenon behind the man flu, where men are sicker from a given illness than women are. I mentioned this to my wife, and she said, men are a bunch of babies. So if you want to build a mountain range out of a molehill, you can use this study to suggest that the man flu is a real deal and that viruses make men sicker than women. I don't know. I suppose anything that can justify my illness is a good thing. Mumps is in a decade-long high this year. There have been at least 250 cases in the last 4 weeks, about 4 times the normal number of measles, according to the MMWR. And for the year 2016, we have 3,832 cases of mumps. Thank you, those of you who oppose vaccines. Also, 2 interesting things about measles. There was a report out of China of 12 people with acute measles encephalitis who did not have a rash, the vast majority of whom had either 1 or no vaccinations against measles. 1 of the 12 had long-term sequelae, and they wonder if there's some significance to the fact that most of them were under-vaccinated. And finally, there's a report out of the Netherlands. They had an outbreak of measles, and of the healthcare workers, there were 6 healthcare workers who had been vaccinated against measles but got measles anyway. The important thing, however, is that all the cases were mild and none of them resulted in secondary infections. I think it's important to remember that vaccination is not an all or none phenomenon. Not only can you prevent disease with it, but you may still get the disease, but it will be milder. And when it's milder, you're much less likely to pass it on to someone else. So the benefits of vaccinations are a spectrum of good things, including probably less measles encephalitis. Quick, what and where is Manitoba? Wrong, it's not a city, it's a Canadian province. Winnipeg is the big city. It's just north of North Dakota and Minnesota. You have to know your geography to understand the range of infectious diseases. So they looked at blood specimens in patients that had their blood collected for the question of Lyme disease. So presumptively they had a tick exposure or something to suggest Lyme disease. And they looked to see what the seroreactivity of anaplasma was. And it was quite high. 23% had IgG, and a third had positive IgM. Given that the rates of diagnosed anaplasma are much less in Manitoba than the seropositivity would suggest, it's a disease that is markedly underdiagnosed in that part of the world, and probably in Minnesota and North Dakota as well. Ticks and mosquitoes. Good ways to get infections. Beware the bloodsucker. And as long as we're on the topic of tick-borne illnesses, Babesia on occasion can be acquired through transfusions. In Connecticut and Massachusetts, they estimate the rate is 14 per 253,031 unscreened blood donations. They then tested the blood with a PCR looking for Babesia, and as a result, their transmission rate went to 0. There has been an ongoing problem of outbreaks of Elizabeth Kingii infections in the Midwest. Evidently, this bug used to be called either Flavobacterium or Crislip. It's a gram-negative bacillus found in the environment, and they've had outbreaks in both Illinois and Wisconsin. The question is whether or not this is a point outbreak or not. The most recent data published in the MMWR suggests that these infections are not, in fact, due to point source outbreaks, but are just the random badness of sick patients. There are two Elizabeth Kingias, by the way. There is meningosepticum, which causes meningitis. And then there is E. anopheles, which was found first in the midgut of a mosquito. Who goes looking in the midgut of mosquitoes for bacteria? But has subsequently been found to cause nosocomial outbreaks with high morbidity and mortality, such as the cases in the upper Midwest. I have never seen a case of bubonic plague, and it honestly is not on my to-do list of infections I really want to see. When I think of transmission of bubonic plague, I think of people who hunt rodents or dogs who hunt rodents. But cats are also a source of bubonic plague in human beings. And there was a description in the MMWR of cat-associated bubonic plague. Interestingly, quote, cats are highly susceptible to plague illness and can transmit disease to humans directly through exposure to respiratory droplets and infectious body fluids such as bites and scratches. And it turns out that cats tend to give people pneumonic plague. As the poor little kitty cat sneezes in your face, oh, isn't that cute? They're spewing bubonic plague into the air and you. It's why 43% of pneumonic plague in the United States was due to cat exposure. So if you live in the bubonic-infested West, beware the dog and beware the cat. Empiric therapy for really sick patients, and sometimes not so really sick patients, consists of vancomycin plus a beta-lactam of some sort. Piptazo, cefepime, ceftriaxone, meropenem, depending on the patients. And then they grow MSSA out of the blood. Have you done them harm? This study looked at outcomes in patients who had staph bacteremia and were initially receiving either an anti-staphylococcal penicillin or a cephalosporin. And in this case, the cephalosporin was either cefuroxime or ceftriaxone. And the good news is that there was no impact, at least for the first 28 days, on mortality in patients. So the beta-lactam they got, be it cefuroxime or ceftriaxone, while generally considered not to be optimal for treating Staph aureus bacteremia, was good enough to keep them from dying while they awaited their infectious disease consultation and more proper care. The patients did receive a hodgepodge of other antibiotics, including ciprofloxacin, gentamicin, rifampin, and vancomycin, but it was pretty much the same in both groups. So it's safe to say that the other cephalosporins, at least for the first week or so, are good enough. This study was out of Finland, where it looks like is true for the rest of the world. Non-infectious diseases don't really know how to treat Staph aureus bacteremia, even in the year 2016. The pharmacy tells me that I give more daptomycin than anybody else. Maybe I should get a kickback from Cubicin. I don't. It's illegal and immoral, but still. And the reason I give so much daptomycin is it's once a day, and often with my elderly population, it's a choice between a once-a-day antibiotic or nursing home placement. And for some weird reason, these old people don't want to go to nursing homes. Go figure. So this is a retrospective, real world, for whatever that's worth. It's only important if you're on MTV, I suppose. Real world probably means you can't make heads or tails out of it. And it was evaluation of the effectiveness of daptomycin in the treatment of osteomyelitis and orthopedic device infections, and found good results. 82% of Staph aureus and 82% of coagulase-negative staphylococcal infections were clinical successes by using daptomycin, which is about as good as vancomycin or other anti-staphylococcal drugs that aren't a beta-lactam. Although we so need comparative trials, I guess we're stuck with retrospective, with all the flaws therein. I suppose the nice thing about real-world evaluations of things like killing bacteria is you have a really solid endpoint as to whether or not you cure your infection, as opposed to a real-world evaluation of pseudomedicine like homeopathy or acupuncture. So maybe I shouldn't be so dismissive of real-world studies that are at least based in reality, unlike the real-world studies of pseudomedicines. Yeah, like this study on ceftriaxone and Staph aureus bacteremia. It shows it works pretty well, with a 68% clinical success rate. Patients did, of course, get C. difficile, and don't forget neutropenia, an important side effect of ceftriaxone. But again, what's the best drug to treat MRSA? Daptomycin? Vancomycin? Ceftriaxone? Who knows? All we have is retrospective studies that say, yeah, it probably works okay. But I want to know what's best. And I'm impressed at this study. Evidently, they don't have a lot of penton-valentine leukocidin back in the Netherlands. So they looked at outcomes in patients who had Staph aureus bacteremias, whether or not they had penton-valentine producing or not, and found that if they had the gene for penton-valentine leukocidin, they had a marked increase in their deaths, and that 80% of the deaths they had due to Staph aureus bacteremia were in those who were positive for the gene that codes for the penton-valentine leukocidin, although it only accounted for 1.4% of their strains. All I can say is, whoa. And I know the data for Staph aureus bacteremia is variable in terms of combination antibiotics, but I sometimes wonder if all severe staph bacteremia should initially be treated with an additional antibiotic that somehow messes with protein synthesis. I know the data is variable for rifampin, clindamycin, and linezolid depending on the strains of organisms. It would be nice if we could know with the rapidity of methicillin resistance if the patients were Luc F positive as well. those would definitely be people I would have on something that would mess with protein synthesis. The problem is always the heterogeneity, not only of the hosts and the antibiotics, but the genetics of the staph that make it difficult to know for a given beast what's the best way to kill it. I mean, besides autoclave. The guidelines always drive me nuts because they usually tell you to do everything in every patient every time. For example, everybody with staph bacteremia, they say should get a TEE, which is a stupid waste of resources. You always have to ask yourself the question, is the study you're going to get make any difference to what you're going to do to the patient? And this study looked at why people do or do not get transesophageal echocardiograms for Staph aureus bacteremias, and not just any people, but infectious disease physicians. And 3/4 of the time, the ID doc did not get a TEE because they did not suspect endocarditis because the blood cultures cleared right away. I do that. Or the patient had a secondary focus required an extended treatment anyway. And I do that. If you're going to get a long course of antibiotics anyway because of clinical factors, what's the point of spending $1,000 on a TEE if it's not going to change what you do? I'm more likely to get TEEs if I'm worried about a localized myocardial complication like an abscess than I am to determine duration of therapy for Staph aureus bacteremia. And we have talked about the studies in this podcast that do justify not getting TEE in a variety of low-risk situations in patients with Staph aureus bacteremia. But it's nice to know that the infectious disease physicians of Colorado and me think alike, although maybe they may not be happy with that. ID is really kind of simple. You get source control, you give antibiotics promptly. Every time you look at a study, it's all about source control and prompt antibiotics. And this is true, again, of intra-abdominal candidiasis, that if you drain the pus and you get prompt, effective antibiotics, your outcomes are better than if you do neither. That seems kind of obvious, but it's amazing how often source control is delayed in patients when there's nothing heals like cold steel. I guess IR really isn't cold steel, but it has a nice rhyme to it. A bunch of antibiotic stuff. Ceftazidime avibactam is a current horrifically expensive antibiotic combination. Looking back at 37 carbapenem-resistant Enterobacteriaceae, they found a clinical success rate of 59%. The microbiologic failure rate was 30%, and of those, 3 out of 10 had ceftazidime avibactam resistance. So already it has enough resistance that you can't use it empirically. Klebsiella that make the Klebsiella pneumoniae carbapenemase, the KPC, can be killed with this, but not the metallobeta-lactamases, nor the Verona integron-encoded MBL, or an imipenemase. So it would look like the primary effect of this antibiotic, given the spread of metallobeta-lactamases, is to provide selective environmental pressure to increase resistance to bacteria. Go ceftazidime avibactam. I wonder if I will ever prescribe that. Or colistin, for that matter. I still have yet to have the opportunity or the need to give colistin. And this study out of CID looked at the effectiveness of high-dose colistin in a prospective trial and find there was no association between colistin at larger doses and all-cause mortality, but you did damage more kidneys. It's one of the nice things about being in Portland. We're a little behind in some things that you want to be behind in. And remembering that the board got it wrong, resistance is inevitable, not futile. There's a report in the MMWR of a patient with a carbapenem-resistant Enterobacteriaceae, a New Delhi metallobeta-lactamase, who had no reason for it. Humans are basically sentient transport media for bacteria, so it's no surprise that this organism has moved beyond its typical borders and is showing up in patients without travel. Might as well call this drugs I've never used. This was a study that evaluated oral fudic acid with rifampin for the treatment of prosthetic joint infections. And they found that rifampin really messed up fudistic acid levels. So it's a drug-drug interaction that messes up the efficacy of oral fudistic acid. No, it's fusidic acid. My lisdexia is acting up. Fusidic acid, for those of you who are as ignorant as me, is an ancient antibiotic that primarily kills staph and streptococcal species as well as Corynebacterium. It comes from the organism Fusidium coccineum, hence the name fusidic acid. It is a protein synthesis inhibitor that is synergistic with rifampin in the test tube, although, as we have learned, rifampin decreasing the levels to render it ineffective. And evidently it is not available in the United States. And there's not even an entry in my compendium, so I guess if it's not there, it doesn't really exist. Achaogen, Achaogen, evidently is developing a new antibiotic. And the headline in Medscape said, Achaogen's lead antibiotic succeeds in 2 key studies. But I read it as Achaogen's lead antibiotic succeeds in 2 key studies. And I was wondering, why would they use lead for an antibiotic? Wouldn't it be too toxic? Well, there is some efficacy, I suppose, against some bacteria. And perhaps we're getting desperate enough to start trying heavy metals to treat infections again. No, it's lead, not lead. The drug, by the way, is plazomicin, and it's a new aminoglycoside. And there's no lead in it. It's lead-free. And with that bit of whimsy, we will bring this Puscast to a close. Thank you for listening. The references, as always, are available over at edgydoc.com, or just Google the topic and you'll probably find it, since everything I have done has been released in the last 2 weeks or so. Not always, but usually. Otherwise, don't forget as we head into the holidays to go buy as many copies of the Puss Whisperer as you can afford. It makes a wonderful present for everybody in your family. And finally, about the references, they will all be put out one a day over at ID Factoid, which is a Twitter account, and will also be found on the Facebook page for the Infectious Disease Compendium. So if you want to be reinforced for the information you heard here, follow me on Twitter, go to the Facebook page, and every day a new reference. And with that, thank you for this most interesting consultation and allowing me to participate in the care of this most difficult and challenging cases. Thank you in dictation. And, well, I'd like to wish everybody a non-denominational seasonal greeting. See you in 2017.